Welcome to our second panel on disasters, the benefits and perils of disaster thinking. In this session, we're going to take a critical look at the ways in which we need to be more attentive to disasters, potential disasters and their implications, and also the ways in which a disaster lens may conversely hinder the development of long-term strategic adaptation responses. Explore all kinds of questions around that. So we have three wonderful panelists here. Our first panelist, Dr. Sabrina McCormick, is an associate professor in the Environmental and Occupational Health Department at George Washington University. Sabrina's work examines extreme impacts of climate-related disasters, and she's a lead IPCC author on extreme risk and disaster management. Sabrina also makes documentary films that aim to transform science into stories that compel social action, and she's currently an associate producer of the Showtime series, The Years of Living Dangerously. Very cool. Our second panelist is Jonathan Reeves. He hails from the Office of Emergency Management in at DC Water. Jonathan is all about disasters, as you may have learned yesterday. He directs DC Water's emergency response and planning activities and the authority's involvement in the National Capital Region Critical Infrastructure Protection Program. He also developed and now oversees a comprehensive national incident management system for the authority that includes the Emergency Management Accreditation Program. He also likes to tell interesting stories of Australia, if you ask. Our third panelist, Dr. David Titley, is an expert in the field of climate, the Arctic, and national security. He's currently professor of practice in the Department of Meteorology at the Pennsylvania State University and founding director of Penn State Center for Solutions to Weather and Climate Risk. Dr. Titley served as a naval officer for 32 years, working on naval meteorology, oceanography, and navigation, rising to the rank of Rear Admiral. While serving in the Pentagon, Dr. Titley initiated and led the U.S. Navy's Task Force on Climate Change, which has made invaluable contributions to raising the importance of climate change considerations for U.S. security and resilience. So welcome to our panel. We'll go talks first and then questions, Q&A after. Thank you.
Good morning. How's everybody doing? Good. Good. So hopefully this is not going to be a depressing panel. I think if we're following in line with what's happened so far this morning, I found it inspirational and really exciting to be here. So many new ideas, not just about the risks related to climate change, but what we might be able to do about it to build resilience. I'm also really excited to be here because I was a AAAS fellow at EPA prior to going back to academia, and I've spent a lot of time in your seat, but never been up here, and so it's very exciting to look out from this perspective. So I'm going to talk about how we can transition people feeling kind of abstracted and distant, separated from the idea of climate change, which can often seem like a very distant phenomenon, how we can make it more visible and tangible to people such that they can engage with building a climate movement, building resilience more generally. But before I talk, I want to hear something from you. I want to give you a little quiz, because what I'm going to talk mostly about today is about heat waves. So for you, how many people died in the 2003 Western European heat wave? Here are your options. A, 250 to 300, B, 10,000 to 12,000, or C, 50,000 to 70,000. Raise your hand if you think it's A. It's an open question, no judgment. B. Okay, more hands. C. All right, so I'm not going to tell you the answer just yet, because I'm going to give you the same quiz about the Eastern European heat wave that happened in 2010, and I'll give you the same options. A, 250 to 300, B, 10,000 to 12,000, or C, 50,000 to 70,000. So A, raise your hand. B, raise your hand. C, raise your hand. Okay. So you guys in the C category are correct on both counts. The 2003 Western European heat wave killed around 70,000 people, something that when I give talks in the United States, people are shocked to hear. The Eastern European heat wave in 2010 killed about 54,000 people. So heat waves are killing more people in the United States, let's just talk about the United States for a moment, than all other extreme weather events combined. This is something that I think we generally don't realize, in part because when we think about a heat wave, we don't even know what it looks like. This is an image of St. Petersburg during the Eastern European heat wave. Kind of so what, right? People are walking around with masks on. We're not seeing something that's incredibly catastrophic like we see in other climate-related extreme weather events, right? Which are incredibly compelling, incredibly visual, and really make us think about the impacts of climate change. Now, for those of you in the A and B categories who are thinking, well, how many people could actually be dying of heat waves? How big a risk could it actually be? You're not alone. These quotes are from a piece of research that my colleagues at University of Michigan and I have done in several cities in the United States, where we are looking at the way that cities, city governments and NGOs, as well as vulnerable communities, are responding to the risks of heat waves. And generally what we found is that people are not that concerned. So in the first quote, you see a local government employee saying, talking about how his colleagues have been thinking about heat risks and their discussions. He says, they were like, you kidding? The government is spending money to find out that poor people suffer from heat? That is ridiculous. There's just this attitude. You live in a desert. What do you expect? It's hot. So there's mixed thoughts on how important heat is here. And this is a city in the Southwest. And then another community leader who works on heat preparedness said, so we have this problem for 3 months out of the year. And where in some other areas that might be a constant situation, I know that we do have plans to provide information to folks on locations they can go to, what to do in terms of drinking water, staying hydrated. But I'm not sure that there's any more that needs to be done. And so we have a kind of ubiquitous sense of security around heat, something that is killing a lot of people, but we've normalized to some degree. And this is despite the fact that climate change, one of the most clearly scientifically substantiated outcomes of climate change is temperature change, right? Climate change is projected to increase overall increases in temperature, as well as increases in frequency and severity of extreme weather events. Now, these are different scenarios from the lowest growth to the highest growth. Highest growth scenario by 2090. It's going to be much, much hotter than it is, even in the short term. So by 2040, some scientists are saying we're looking at something like heat events rising by 100-fold. This is not long term, right? This is in my lifetime and the lifetimes of most of the people in this room. The IPCC, and probably most of you are familiar with this hockey stick graph, says that they are virtually certain that increases in frequency and magnitude of temperature extremes will occur. And based on these multiple scenarios, the highest growth scenario, of course, of which we are along track with and actually exceeding, a 1 in 20-year hottest day is likely to become a 1 in 2-year event by the end of the 21st century. So we're looking at something like a 10-fold increase in risks of what we face today. So with this risk, why is it that we are normalizing heat risk? Why is it that we think of it as something that's maybe not that big a deal? And so as I mentioned, I think one of the factors is that it's largely invisible. But also, those who experience heat risks to the greatest degree are also politically marginalized. So we have people of lower socioeconomic status living in highly dense urban environments, which research has found has less green space and higher temperatures generally. We have people over 65 and under 5 being the groups that experience the greatest risks from heat waves and don't have a very strong political voice. And then another factor is that our institutions and the way that we estimate and calculate and classify heat-related morbidity and mortality is actually often inaccurate, I would argue, and a lot of the research I've been doing on heat risks shows that the death certificates that are used to assess heat risk on the part of the federal government and local governments are often essentially inaccurate. The risk of heat waves gets lost in the diagnostic process. And many researchers, including myself, are arguing that therefore we have massive underestimations of heat mortality and heat morbidity, despite the fact that with the estimations we have, that more people are dying of heat waves than all other the extreme weather events combined. And so in an effort to turn this invisible risk into a more visible risk, I've been working as a producer on a new Showtime series called The Years of Living Dangerously. How many of you have heard of this? Nice, great. How many of you get Showtime? Right, yeah, this is the bigger problem. So, for most of us, including myself, who don't get Showtime, you're going to get the opportunity to see 5 minutes of the series. So the series, for those of you who don't have the full lay of the land, it's 9 episodes. It's a documentary series with 18 stories featuring a celebrity correspondent in each story. We are headed to the last episode, being on this coming Monday night. So what I'm going to do is show you a clip from the episode that aired, what day is it today? Yes, this past Monday, so just a few days ago. And let me just introduce you to what the clip is before I show it to you, because it's towards the end of this particular episode. So in each episode, there are 2 to 3 stories interwoven, and one of the stories in episode 8, the one on Monday, is about heat waves, starring Matt Damon. So we send Matt on a journey to understand and investigate what is happening in his new city of Los Angeles regarding heat risk. We take him all over the city. We introduce him to the coroner and to scientists, one of whom you are going to be meeting in this clip, named Dr. Rupa Basu, who's an epidemiologist at California Environmental Protection Agency, who's been working on this issue of heat mortality. So I think with that, I'm going to get to the clip, I hope. Yes. Okay, let's hope this is going to work. Oh, yeah, right. So can we please pause recording? And for those of you who are web streaming, I'm sorry, we're going to have to take a pause because this is Showtime material. I don't have license to web stream it. So those of you in the room here are the only ones that are going to get to see this. Sorry to everybody online. So, I would argue that the case of heat waves is actually, it's different from, but it's not totally distinct from a lot of other climate change related phenomena, and all the climate change related illnesses that we see increasing, such as air pollution related illnesses, asthma, cardiopulmonary diseases resultant from increasing ozone, ground level ozone levels related to temperature increase, water and foodborne disease, vector-borne disease. And many of the illnesses, injuries, and even mortality from extreme weather events are often invisible to us because we don't necessarily make the direct link between climate change and the illness outcome, or climate change and many other outcomes. And so I would argue that it's really our responsibility to begin to do that now. And the National Climate Assessment that came out recently said the United States has already been experiencing climate change. So beginning to be able to make the link between these phenomenon, such as heat-related illness and death, and climate change itself, is incredibly important. And so conceptually, I think the first thing we can do, and some of you are in the position to be able to kind of push this idea forward, is to be able to monitor and diagnose, pinpoint the outcomes of climate change more specifically. But less conceptually and more substantively, we can make illnesses and phenomena related to climate change more visible. And the research shows that this is a way to motivate people. And referring back to Dr. Dorsey's comments this morning about being an inspiration, one way we can motivate people to take action to mitigate climate change and to build resilience is to provide them with visual information that makes problems more salient, potentially accelerates social learning, and motivates people by arousing emotions and making climate change kind of feel closer to home. So ultimately, I would say this is one fundamental piece of building resilience, building a climate movement like President Obama has asked us to do, and many of us are already engaged in. And you may say, well, I don't have access to Matt Damon, and I definitely don't have a fancy camera, but we all know that in this digital age, we are all photographers, we are all filmmakers, we all have access. In fact, I would say probably most of us in this room have access to a smartphone or some form of camera camera. So do it yourself. And in fact, I think that has the potential to be much more compelling than a Showtime series to which most of us don't have access, right? So I would motivate you to do that on your own as well, and to talk to your friends, family, colleagues about it, as you probably are already doing. So with that, I'll wrap up and look forward to talking to you more about this after the rest of our speakers. So thank you.
So many screens.
And big thanks to Darshan for managing, juggling, and coaxing the various machinery.
It's still very bright up here. Anyway, I'd just like to report back on everybody. We have our first action item from the conference, from my question from the gentleman yesterday about looking at emerging species and emerging contaminants in the river. The next meeting of the ICPRB, we've tabled that as an action item for us to investigate and look at actual potential threats to the Potomac River and our water source. So we have an action item. Look at that. So I was asked by Irina to come and talk to you guys about, you know, this sort of notion of disaster thinking and the perils of that and the challenges of that. And I thought I could offer everybody a real life operational perspective. You know, these are things that real organisations like mine are dealing with every day, and in some ways struggling to meet the requirements. I was very happy that Sabrina talked about heat, because it's one of the things I'm also going to focus on. And for those of us that spent the winter here, I'm also going to focus on the cold, because just like the heat, the cold is also an issue. So I'd just like to start just briefly. So I wanted to talk about some of the actual climate impacts. I think it's important to understand from the people in the room, you know, what is the city? You know, do we know what the city is going to look like, or what it's predicted to look like? And do we know what the expectations for what the city is going to look like in the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years? I want to talk about our responses and you know, what we are doing to prepare for these sorts of events. And then just quickly on a little bit of drummer boy bandstanding and just some of the actual mitigation efforts that are completed and that are ongoing here at DC Water. So for those of you that don't believe, or for those of you from the Midwest that say you only get tornadoes in the Midwest, this was last year. That was one of 5 confirmed tornadoes we've had here in the District of Columbia in the last 5.5 years. We do get tornadoes. This particular one did about $300,000 worth of damage to our facility down at Blue Plains. And it seems to be I don't know whether it correlates with my arrival from Australia, but it seems to be the longer I've been here at DC Water, the worse the disasters seem to be getting and the more frequently they occur. So I consider it a little bit of job security, but it really has. I actually had the general manager comment to me that he's never seen so many emergencies since I arrived. So I just wanted to go back historically. Most people, I'd guarantee nearly all people in this room didn't realise that one of the floods of record in this country, or in the city, was in 1936. And that was the impact of the storm. I want to show this because I want everybody to pay attention to this for what I'm going to show you in the next slide. But this is basically the level of inundation from that event. So this is I believe this is the NOAA 10-foot projection for sea level rise by 2030. And as you can see, it looks incredibly similar to the 1936 flood event. Now, we have a number of mitigation strategies that already exist to prevent the little arc of line, and I wish I had a pointer to show it to you, but from just above the 2030, that basically spreads across the Capitol, across the White House, and down that central monumental core. For any of you that have driven down 17th Street and seen all the construction on Constitution and 17th, has everybody seen that? They know what I'm talking about? Do they know why it's there? Does anybody know what that is? Anybody want to yell from the crowd? Come on, the lady in the back with her hand up.
Floodgates.
It's a floodgate. So we're currently, as a joint agency, joint city project, we're upgrading the 17th Street levee, which actually prevents that crescent flooding. The issue you have with that thought process and how we all function in the city as an organisation is who here believes that a permanently closed floodgate on 17th Street wouldn't disrupt the flow of traffic through the District of Columbia? You know, like you're really talking about some serious impacts to the way we are expected or the way we believe that we're going to function here in the city. Now, you know, the previous slide I jumped over, and I'm sorry I had them out of sync. You know, the various models show from 3.5 feet down to sort of a 1 foot, half-foot rise. And I was talking to a few people yesterday about this. Where this poses a problem is people look at this and they say, oh, well, you know, it's only 2 extra feet. At the moment, the city floods here at about 9 feet over standard high water level. We start to get flooding in the city. But if you actually take that change, it means that more and more of these events are actually going to cause this catastrophic flooding event. So where you may see this event happen once in, you know, 100 years or once in every, you know, 70 or 80 years, you may see these happen annually. So that's really where the challenges are going to come from responding to these sorts of events, here specifically in the capital. But anyway, I also put this up just so people know, you know, this is what the city looked like. We had a massive big creek in the middle where our capital central core, monumental core is. You can actually go and see the boathouse that's still on the corner of 17th and Constitution. You know, the city looks very much like it will when the sea level does start to rise or we do get river flooding and inundation. And you see these lines, which are the non-existent creeks that aren't there now, and most of that is our main sewer infrastructure. So it's actually a very good indicator in the city. And obviously, again, I don't have my pointer, but where you see most flooding in the city is most of the points where those old creeks exist. So LaDroit Park, Bloomingdale, Navy Yard, southeast and southwest waterfront. And for those of you that have lived here and haven't lived here, it's over the past 3 or 4 years, it really has become more of an amplified problem. So we have seen increased levels of flooding. These photos, 3 sets of photos are for 3 or 4 different years. The one at First and V is very interesting because it's all about perception. Does anybody in the room know what that is? It's a sanitary sewer overflow. So we received a call from the city telling us that we had a water main break on the street. We need to come and deal with it. Because the people that reported it couldn't believe that much water could come out of a 12-inch manhole. It had to be a water main break. And, you know, we're starting to, our response posture to respond to these events is becoming more and more of a steady state crisis response every day and less of a punctuated events that may occur once every 1, 3, 5, 7 years. So some of the things we're doing to prepare for this, and part of what Sabrina talked about with the heat, and it sort of, it clicked in my mind, was beyond our sort of standard preparedness, we now actually deploy heating and cooling vans with our workers. So we actually send out heating and cooling centres because the temperatures here in the city can get that hot that it's nearly impossible to function as a work crew digging in the street unless you do have relief from the heat and conversely in January from the cold. So that in itself manifests itself as additional expense, additional cost, additional manpower, additional hiring, additional vehicles, additional emissions. Like, it just continues to feed itself on. And for anybody that cares to look up on the website, you can see what it's done to our overtime budgets, what it's done to our capital equipment budgets, what it's done to our operating budgets. You know, it has really been a severe challenge to the organisation. So one of the other things, and that has been probably somewhat critical and also necessary, is there is this now an understanding that we are all really in the same boat. And I know Amy Tass is in the room, and who would have thought as an emergency manager I'd be doing lots of work with the NCPC, but it seems to be that these events force us all to have to work as one group, you know, and is a lot of work being done on our flood mitigation and our stormwater mitigation plans. So some of the other preparedness things, we have, we've adopted the federal government's. I know that FEMA takes a whack for a lot of things, and the last panel had a few accurate criticisms of FEMA, but they do actually do one thing well, and that's emergency response planning and creating management systems for emergency response. So we do that. We use their planning system. One of the reasons for that is it creates consistency. It allows us as a utility to function the same way as other organisations, other federal agencies function, and so it allows us to sort of speak at these events more consistently. And then some of the challenges we have. The city here in its wisdom had created a special datum for the District of Columbia. For those of you that live here, we know we're all more special than everybody else. We're all special and everybody's a VIP. But what that's created is when you look at the weather datum here in the district, it gets reported on 5 different datums. And what that does is, I don't know, is the lady here from the canoe club? Is she here still, the lady? Yesterday I was talking to a lady from the canoe club. We were doing a response due to the flooding 2 weeks ago, and everybody from the canoe club turned up to move their canoes because the weather, the television reported that there was going to be 11.5 foot of water over the canoe club at Wisconsin Avenue. Well, that wasn't factual. It was 11.5 feet from the mean low water level at Little Falls, which is 9 feet different from the actual NAVD 88 datum at Wisconsin. So you get this, just what do the numbers mean? And even myself, I do this stuff all the time. You get this report from somebody and you look at it and you say, well, have they made a mistake? Have I made a mistake? Did the person that gave them the information make a mistake? And it really creates a challenge for accurate information. Is what you're looking at, how do you manifest that into an operational response? And how do you manifest that into an operational response when it's occurring 6, 7, 8, 9 times a year? And then with most of my slides, I put maintaining the rage. DC Water is a massive utility. Right? We have 1,200 employees, we have our own engineering group, our own GIS group, we have our own weather group, we have 6 operational groups, we have fleet management. When you go into these what I'll call crisis events, it is nearly impossible to sustain them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we're a large utility. So, some of the challenges we see are going to be with the smaller utilities in other parts of the country and even in surrounding jurisdictions where a lot of the people that commute into the city live, because they just do not have the people. So some of my counterparts that I work with within driving distance of the district may have 8 employees, or 10, or 15. And these events are creating the same level of challenges and they have nowhere near the manpower. So it has been a real challenge and a real issue. And what are some of the lessons learned? I always like to talk about areas of improvement, or frankly where we screwed up. And I think one of them is accepting that severe weather events and however that may manifest itself, whether it be heat, whether it be cold, flooding, tornadoes, famine and plague, it's the new normal. So it is the way that we have to conduct business, and it's the way that we are going to have to continue to provide that 24/7, 365-day service that I talked about yesterday. And that is going to be more expensive. I like to use the example with Sandy as opposed to the derecho, for those of you that were here to experience the derecho. The derecho, we spent $0 on planning. The storm came, it did us damage, we responded as our normal response posture. Our preparation for Sandy was $395,000, which we cost the residents of the District of Columbia. It manifests itself in your bills. The storm turned at the 11th hour, passed us by, and that preparedness planning money was spent. It's spent, it's gone, it's done. But in hindsight, no tangible benefit. to the customer or tangible benefit to the organisation. So it is important to note that, you know, these sorts of events, that planning is expensive and it's a significant cost, and it's not something you can do for free. And we see in a lot of these crisis situations, I don't think people in the community realise, you know, when we talk about USAR teams, that's always my favourite discussion point. You know, when we talk about the earthquakes in Haiti, does anybody know how much it costs per day to deploy a USAR team?
I'm not sure what you're
Urban Search and Rescue?
What are you talking about when you say USAR thing?
USAR, Urban Search and Rescue Team. So when we have a disaster, a crisis, and we deploy a team, Urban Search and Rescue, we send 85 people out to go and rescue people. It's about $150,000 a day. It costs about $2 million a year to support a team. You know, like there are significant, severe costs involved in these events, and as they're getting more severe and they're getting more prolonged and more complex, you are seeing more and more. Oh, I've been told to stop by the lady down the front with the nice smile. And with that, I'll end before she zaps me with her. Well, Tessa, thank you. You missed 4 of them. You were like 5 minutes, and then you were like, stop.
Oh, they were plenty of them, actually.
You're meant to be on my side.
Well, I ignored all of them in the morning. We'll see. Yes, Okay, so the good news is we're back on this computer. Let's see. We could either give Sabrina's presentation again. She has cool Showtime stuff.
Oh.
But
could
I
finish
thought
my
for
last 2 slides for me.
I could, but I probably won't. We're not going to do that
Mitigation.
one. We're going to look for, where did it go? No, that's different. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that'll work. We'll do this again. Okay. If we can find the right one. There we go. Disaster Day. That's a good place to start. There. Okay, so how much time do you think I have? 15, give or take? Okay, well, we'll try for that. All right, I guess I get to pinch hit here. So James said, talk about whatever you want to talk about, which is a kind of a dangerous thing to tell me.
But then I said talk about disasters.
So it will be vaguely on topic. What I'm actually going to do is I'm probably going to take about 3 slides from yesterday, and I just want to kind of go over them in light of what we have all heard for the last 24 hours or so. And then I am going to talk a little bit about some disasters. I'm going to talk about storm surge, and I'm going to talk about how places come back and don't come back, and maybe it complements some of the things we heard from Harriet and Barbara, Nate and Daniel earlier on here. Okay, so why do we care? Again, you know, this is about people. You know, I think somebody was talking about motivation. You know, this is not polar bears. This is people. This is you, me, and our families. Water is a pretty good integrating concept. Heat's a nice integrating concept. It does kill a lot of people. But the thing with water is, frankly, if you're trying to show people, you know, what were your slides? They were water slides. You know, they're water people can get. They understand that. And oh, by the way, if you don't have water, it's hard to grow food, you know, stuff like that. If you don't have water, it's hard to have your energy sources, stuff like that. So I like water as an integrating concept. You can certainly use other things. And like heat, the changes in water you're on exceptionally solid science. Those are the 2 biggest, most solid things. If you're talking about climate change, you can talk about change in temperature, change in water distribution. There's no, well, at least 97% of the respected climate scientists are not going to disagree with you on those. I got to testify with John Christie. That's another story for another day. And it's the change. It's this, you know, we just heard this from Jonathan. We've really heard this all the time. I mean, the scary part is not that we don't all live in San Diego where it's a perfect 65 degrees every day of the year for every hour of the day. But what we have been accustomed to, not only in our personal lives, but frankly in human civilization, is now changing. And it's going to change pretty quickly. And if we don't both adapt to that and ultimately figure out a way to slow and stop that change, we will have, for humans, a very, very different Earth than the ones that we literally have have figured out how to produce our civilization. I've got these guys up here again, Dan Kahan and Daniel Kahneman, because we kept hearing yesterday and today, how do you talk about the messages? We heard Daniel, our Daniel, not these guys, talk about Kansas, and he wasn't saying, hey guys, let's all become climate change radicals, right? How much do you think that message would have sold? It's like, what is a self-interest? How do you talk about this, if you listen to Kahan, about basically how do you stay within your tribe? But there are messages, as I think the Kansas example is a wonderful, or the Kansas Greensburg is a wonderful example of, in which you can get actions, the actions that we all need, without sort of having to come across as this wide-eyed or wild-eyed environmental climate radical. Now, if you're like trying to get Berkeley and stuff like that, that's probably the right message, that works there. But for a lot of the country, it doesn't. So figuring out the right message. We've got lots of lawyers in the room, I'm sure. What's the saying? If you can't get them for murder, get them for tax evasion, right? So get them for tax evasion, It doesn't, it's the outcomes that matter. It's not whether they, quote, believe, I hate that phrase, believe in climate, it's the outcomes that matter. Okay, I'm going to go back to this, what can one person do? We've talked about some of the things. I just kind of like that picture, it's like one person, okay, a guy named happened to be Nelson Mandela, but it was, but it's this, what can you do? The one on the lower right is where I gave a climate talk in the basement of the library in McConnellsburg, Pennsylvania. How many people know where McConnellsburg is? That's what I had until I found out I was going there too. I had no idea where it was. Turns out it's about 100 miles due south of Penn State. There is no road that goes due south, so anyways. But total grassroots organization. It was a demand signal. I didn't say, okay, well, I'm from the university and I'm here to help you. They wanted to go learn about climate change. So that brings in my cute little llamas, because I don't have viral cats, but I can have viral llamas for the internet here. But the L is, the first L is learn. And there's lots of ways you can do it. There's skepticalscience.com, there's Earth the Operator's Manual, there's lots of places to learn about this. Now, Dan Kahan talks about, the more you know, that doesn't necessarily change your perception. And that's absolutely true, but that doesn't, but he's not saying ignorance is where we want to be. He's not arguing that. So basic knowledge is good. We're not going to zero out the STEM, the science, technology, engineering, math kind of education. We shouldn't do that. We need basic education. So learn. The second one is local action. What can you do? I mean, I've just spent a few $1,000s upgrading the insulation of my 1940s house, upgrading the drainage. I have flood insurance, even though I'm not remotely close to a flood zone. But more and more, when I see random communities getting 5, 6, 7, 8 inches of rain in less than a day, there is no, well, I mean, Jonathan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's many, if any, municipal drainage systems that are designed to deal with that. That wasn't in the specs. So guess what? Everything around there is going to flood. Okay, I can't change the drainage system of State College, but I can kind of protect myself for about $155 a year. To me, that's an investment worth it. When we look at, where did I buy? I bought a place so that I could walk to work. I don't have to have a car. Now, it's 219 miles to get down to talk to all of you guys. I can't fix that right now. But, you can do what you have. I tell ranchers, hey, if you need a pickup truck, I get it. I'm not saying you can't, you've got to drive a Prius on your ranch. But do what you can. Do what you can. It's like if you go to the doctors and the doc says, you're 45 pounds overweight, he's not going to say, hey, Titley, go run a marathon tomorrow. He's going to say, Titley, maybe you want to lose a few pounds. Why don't you start walking? So why don't we start walking? And then it's like, well, maybe you can jog a little bit. And then it's like, holy, hey, we can actually do stuff. So local action, do what you can. Monitor. That's the monitoring and understanding. This is the, can we actually get better? It's really hard to, we've heard a lot of things on climate change and the attributions. Most of the attributions I've heard are okay. Some are a little shaky. When we get down the tornado road, it gets really shaky. That's okay. You know, that's not really for the public to have to figure out. But for policymakers, and this is supposed to be about governance, you know, it's hard to make good policy, especially when it comes down to attribution, if the science community can't really say. And part of that fundamental part is monitoring, it's observations. Our observation system in this country is fundamentally, it's about a D on a A to F scale. We sort of lurch from piece to piece. It's a patchwork. There's tons of NRC studies out. It's not like technically we don't know how to do this, but it's all sort of this lack of will to actually invest a modest amount of money so that we can actually understand the Earth system writ large in which we live. So that's my M. And besides, you got to have an M if you have a llama, right? So I got to have an M. And then the A is advocacy. And I kind of put this, I've been asked so many times, it's like, well, what can I do? You know, how can I change? You know, Washington's broken, this is broken, it's all corrupt, it's this, it's that. And it's like, well, actually, you know, politicians do listen. They do. They want to get reelected. And yes, I know about the, you know, gerrymandering and the balkanization and da-da-da, but you know they listen. And if climate is sort of like number 19 of 20, or number 20 of 19, I forget what it was, pretty low, you know, if that's not on your list, why should it be on theirs? Well, you would say, well, they're supposed to be smarter than us. They respond. You know, it'd be great if they led, but they can, it would be great if they would lead, but they can be led. And you guys and gals are the ones who can lead them. So ask your politicians, what are you doing to stabilize the climate? You know, and my little thing on this is don't let them answer with a yes or no. Don't ask a yes or no question. Don't ask, do you support a tax on carbon? Because it's like, oh, well, I shouldn't do this because blah, blah, blah. And then, you know, boom, done, check. Ask some kind of a question that is not a yes or no, like, how are we going to stabilize the climate? How are we going to stop this March of the Time series? You don't have to tell them time series because they probably won't know what that is. But we're at AAAS, so we can talk about that. So that we and our children and our children's children can have a stable world with decent jobs and decent living and all that kind of stuff. So that's the advocacy. And there's advocacy down at the local levels, at regional levels. Ask what they're doing about this issue. You know, it's the old thing. You know, if your boss is interested, you guys are fascinated. Right, somebody's heard my brief before. And, you know, in some ways, we're kind of their boss. Okay, enough of that. You know, some disasters happen, but they're a long ways away, so we don't pay it that much attention. But this was Thailand, screwed up the auto industry, and really kind of screwed up the computer industry, too, because we're globalized. Remember, I had that globalization thing. Okay, so, you know, but it's like, okay, that's not all that dramatic. I almost worked on Years of Living Dangerously over a beer. I can tell you that story. But I did get to work with Nova on the PBS Nova. So who's heard of Nova? Okay, who has access to PBS? I'm sorry, Sabrina, that was a cheap shot. I'm sorry, I know. Okay, so in January of this year, yeah, 5 minutes, okay, yeah, we'll be there. In January of this year, we ran, Nova ran this. I was privileged enough to work with Nova on this. I'm just going to run about 90 seconds of video here. And I would ask the same things if we could. I'm sorry for anybody who's webcasting. I'm not 100% positive on the whole copyright, so rather than like finding out for some nasty lawyer letters, and this is DC, so there's lots of lawyers, I would just as soon cut that. And I would ask everybody, if you're recording, please turn that off for 90 seconds. Thanks. Okay. Let's see if I can make this run. Okay, this is Super Typhoon Haiyan. This is the storm. Show you that because that really gets an idea of why these are so lethal. These storm surges are so lethal. Oh, okay, can we? Okay, great. I don't count this on my 15 minutes. Kidding. Okay. So that's, okay.
You can unpause the video. Thank you so much.
Okay, however this works. Great. This is Katrina. This is not the Philippines, but it's basically the same thing. This is Katrina, not New Orleans, Mississippi. And this is, you can see how everything is scraped. So it's not just the fact that you have, 10, 15, 20 feet of water, but you guys saw how fast it comes in. So it's like this massive bulldozer that just pushes everything in. And this is just what makes it so lethal here. Okay, I'm going to actually go through those. I've talked about this. This is fascinating with what Barbara has seen in New Orleans and Daniel in Kansas. And Harriet, I think, talked about, Sandy and all these great groups and innovation, and we're going to go out to the community. I don't know, is she here? I don't know if she's here. I hate to say it, all of that was done in Katrina on the Mississippi coast, led by the governor. So it wasn't like just parachuting in from FEMA or DC. It was led by the governor. It did not take hold. So, from an academic point of view, why is it working in some places and not in the others? And do we understand that? Because it's sort of this patchwork of acceptance versus, no, I'm not going to do that. And so that's just something that I think would be a great kind of thing to really understand. Okay, I'm going to just about stop here. This has come up, the funding. It's interesting to me how hard it is to get $1 billion or $2 to do resilience, to do preparations. But as soon as we have a disaster, what was that for Sandy? $60 billion, boom. It's the whole thing for inside the Beltway types, on budget, off budget. Within the agreed upon spending limits, hey, we're just going to tell the feds to print. Somehow we've got to be able to fix that. I don't know how, but that's to look at. If we really want to look at bad things, somebody said, look at some things that really happen. This is a book by Tushman, Barbara Tushman. It's about the 14th century. What does that possibly have to do with? Right in the middle of that is when Europe had the plague. About 30 to 50% of the population died off. Read what happens. It's pretty ugly. So if you want to start looking at bad consequences, what can we learn from the 14th century? The variability, I've talked a lot about this. I won't go through this anymore, but that fact, this is actually how stable the climate is. And you can see about 10,000 years ago, somebody turned a switch off on the variability. And that's when we got human civilization. I don't think that's a coincidence. Okay. Let's see. Yeah. Look forward, not backwards. We tend to look backwards when we're building stuff especially. We used to look backwards. It worked. It worked for thousands of years. We got to look forwards now. Okay? We don't want to do this. Yesterday I ended with Churchill, so we're going to pick an American hero today. John Wayne rather famously said that, life is tough, but it's tougher if you're stupid. So let's not be stupid. Let's finish like these guys did. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, you got it?
Thanks very much to our panelists. We have time for questions. A few minutes for questions now, and then we're going to bring our panelists from the previous session back up. I want to start off, if you guys have questions, make your way to the mics. And I want to start by asking you a question, or maybe asking you to expand a little bit on what you just brought up, that it seems like we've developed a habit of responding to disasters by throwing a lot of money at it, by being able to do things in that situation that aren't possible at other times. And I'm wondering if you can comment some more about how that plays out, and in what ways is that does that bring some benefits, and in what ways is that actually a barrier for long-term change? And I'm posing this question to all of you.
I'll just very, very briefly on this. Who works on the Hill here? Hopefully we have some folks who work on the Hill, and probably some folks who work like either in OMB or in the White House, maybe. My personal view, which plus $2.07 buys you a small coffee at Starbucks, is we've got to have some sort of deal between the executive and the congressional branches of our government on how to do this. Because right now we have these agreed upon spending limits, and of course sequestration's still kind of out there and all of that. But when we have the disaster, I mean, by and large, Katrina, Sandy, and some of these other disasters, it's off budget. So how do we, I mean, I know this sounds an awful inside the beltway policy, everybody else in the country rolls their eyes at this kind of discussion, but without having it by people who understand our system as it is and how we can change it, I don't know that it changes, but maybe others.
So I'll give you all a very good worldly example, and for those of you that are residents, you'll appreciate this. So we had an event coming that we knew was coming. So we approached the Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA for backup support to stage generators. So in case the station was impacted and we wouldn't disrupt service to the community. So during a storm event, we'd all agreed it'd probably be best to do that. We could not get that funded unless we paid the money up front because there is no capacity to prepare and stage and fund it through FEMA. The only way we could have done it is if we had have been disrupted, we then could have requested it and then they would have deployed and sent the funding. So, you know, that's the only way you can do that. So if you were in the situation with Sandy and said, you know, we want to stage, you know, use FEMA resources or use federal, I'll say federal resources to stage and prepare, that cannot be funded by those bodies. It has to be borne by the organisation that's doing the requesting. Now, if you do get, to want a better term, hammered by the event and a disaster is declared, then you can actually claim those costs back. So in some ways, those costs are borne by the community or the organisation and not shared amongst, you know, by the federal partners that have the resources.
So I work on, outside of heat waves, I also work on, is this on? This is not on.
Try to speak
You're
close.
on.
close
I have to
to
speak
it.
really closely to it. I also work on hurricanes and wildfires and West Nile virus, a number of different kinds of extreme events, all of which, and I think this is very important to add to the discussion, are felt at the local level. So climate change is this global phenomenon, which is most, it's very contextually experienced. And so to speak to your question, I'll draw from the case of the worst wildfire experienced in the city of Los Angeles, which took place in 2009, which I did an ethnography of the community there where 500 homes were destroyed. And what happened there is something that happens, I think, in a lot of disasters and has been referenced by other speakers, which is these homes were erased. These people are they're displaced, they have nowhere to go, they're very upset, and immediately politicians step in and say, okay, we're going to rebuild in the same place in almost the exact same way. So we see this over and over. And so this is the problem, but I think one of the opportunities that is offered by a disaster such as that one is that these are moments in which sociologists like myself would say reveal the dynamics of the social dynamics of the community, of governance systems, of et cetera, but also offer opportunities because of those kind of revelatory moments to create a collective consciousness and a collective action that is really otherwise often very difficult to achieve. So these are moments where people are frightened, they're motivated, they have a lot of different emotions. And so I would say there are moments in which we can take advantage of this stimulus, for lack of a better word, to get people to act in different ways. And sometimes that's just getting access to resources because an emergency has been declared. And so there's planning that can be done in advance of figuring out, okay, well, if this disaster happens, how should we then react to it? And that, that's ideal, and it generally doesn't happen. But if that doesn't happen, to try to take that moment to direct resources, activities, motivations in a way that then results in more long-term sustainable kinds of institutions and structures and behaviors.
Yeah, so I guess my question is for all of you, but my name is Aaron, and I'm a congressional fellow this year. So I guess the years of living dangerously kind of strikes a really big emotional chord with a lot of people when you actually watch, because as you said, it's these local changes. So the drought-stricken farms in Texas, a farmer can relate to that. He may not believe in climate change, but he believes that he can no longer build his crops. And I think when you kind of look at using that medium, I'm curious, I guess my question has two parts, is how because everyone in this room, I think, for the most part, is probably a believer in climate change. So speaking outside to that fringe of people who may just need to connect with it emotionally. So one, how do we make sure a show like that reaches these groups? And the other question is, you have, a part on the other side, like you always hear on the TV, and ExxonMobil has a very beautiful commercial with a science teacher and explaining how he motivated his student to go be a petroleum geologist at ExxonMobil. So how do we, if everyone can be sitting in front of the TV set, how do we use that same medium to kind of drive the same kind of thought for, maybe not a petroleum geologist, but I got inspired to become, a climate scientist, or in the realm of that. So it kind of has two parts. How do we integrate using the emotional social connection through social media, but also how do we do it better? Because I ran across a Media Matters report that said in 2012 climate change was on TV for the national networks for 20 minutes. So it's just kind of like, I guess, some thoughts on that.
So I take your question. I take you having two parts of your questions. How do we reach different audiences, and how do we motivate people in new ways?
Yeah.
Is that fair? So, the years of living dangerously, and I wasn't an executive producer, I was a producer. The executive producers are really obviously the most influential folks. But their motivation, I would say, it was to reach new audiences. And so I think one of the key aspects of being able to do that was to bring in new voices. So you refer to these Texas ranchers. And episode 1 is available on YouTube, and you can see in that episode that one of the main stories with Don Cheadle is in the Southwest, this community that's struck by a drought, and so cattle ranchers lose their livelihoods. And these are folks, and the story goes into this in depth, who do not believe in climate change. And in that story also is Catherine Hayhoe, who probably many of you have heard of, who is fabulous communicator about climate change. Her husband is an evangelical minister, and talks about creation care. And I think, being able to put people on film who are maybe not who you think of as traditional climate change kind of people, or people who can become communicators, folks from the military, folks from conservative areas, people from religious communities, those people who can become kind of climate change messengers, I think that's super important. So that's one way I would answer your first question. And in terms of motivating people, so the literature is really, I think, fairly clear on this, that in order to motivate people, and I'll speak specifically to climate change, but I think this relates to a lot of different kinds of threats, you want to scare them, but not just scare them. You want to scare them and then give them an opportunity to do something very concrete. And so you tell them what the threat is and then say, okay, well, if you want to address this threat, here are the possibilities. So in terms of what the years has done, there is a whole kind of huge social media campaign around generating awareness and offering people avenues, strategies for action. And there are a lot of different actions and strategies available on our partner websites, and we've partnered with organizations across the U.S. on generating specific action strategies as well, that some of which go with the stories and some of which go with the larger series. So I think those are very specific ways of addressing and motivating people specifically. So I hope that answers your question.
So before we move to our next question, and don't go anywhere, let me speak into this. I want to invite the speakers from our first panel back up here. And I thought it would be a good opportunity to give all of you, our disaster speakers, a chance to reply to these questions and also have any dialogue amongst you that, any questions that have come up as you've been listening to each other's talks. So let me invite you up here and hold on to your questions, and we'll be set up within seconds.
Irina, while they're setting up, just in response to the previous question, and this is a specific, one of the things we've done at DC Water is to really personalise the message on what we're doing to try and make it better for the customer. So previously all of that stuff was done in anonymity with engineers behind closed doors. The trucks would turn up, they'd dig big holes in your street, and they'd go away and it would all be paved back or not paved back, depending on on what happened. One of the things we've done is really to engage people in that conversation and say to them, we are digging up your street and putting a bigger pipe in, because if we don't, the rainfall you're getting in your neighbourhood is going to explode through your basement and fill the first story of your house up. So, you know, there's definitely getting awareness and buy-in into that conversation and make people, I think a lot of it has to do with awareness, and most disaster that we see is not personal to us. It's something you watch on television or media, or you hear about, or you see in a presentation that happens to someone else. So I think one of the things we've tried to do is personalise the risk and personalise the threats, and really tell people that, hey, we're doing this, your bills are going up, but this is what we're trying to protect against, and these are the consequences.
I just, to the last gentleman's question, very, very quickly, when I get asked this, one of the things I sometimes ask people to look at is look at the gay rights movement. Look at how that went from kind of a fringe issue maybe 10 years ago, where there was very little political cost to say I'm against gay marriage and gay rights in general, to now that dynamic has almost flipped. And a number of people tell me that one of the reasons is in the popular media, the network TV, you know, a number of shows kind of showed, hey, gay people are like normal, like you and me, and, you know, everybody could relate. What's the climate equivalent? Is it Years of Living Dangerously? Myself and Richard Alley were on Earth the Operator's Manual. Again, website, lots of tangible things to do, all that sort of thing. I'm not sure that we've hit it yet, but it's an interesting question on how to do this here.
Thank you.
Hey,
Yep.
I'm Darshan, one of the a AAAS fellow here at EPA. One of the thoughts that we had when we organized these two sessions on disasters was thinking about how people think during disasters. I mean, climate change is both a slow thing and also manifests itself in extreme weather events or frequency of extreme weather events. And so we're very curious to know, at least the four of us when we were planning this, about like, what are the pros and cons of having this way of mentality of planning just for disasters? I mean, how do you plan for slower disasters or sort of more intangible things? And like, yeah, what are the pros and cons of disaster thinking, given that climate change isn't necessarily a disaster in the sense that we generally conceptualize it and the way we generally respond to disasters?
Who runs this panel? Anybody run this?
Anybody
I'll-
wants to reply, jump right in.
I mean, it's, you know, I mean, I had that slide yesterday. It said, you know, we plan for climate, we live in weather. So we're kind of seeing, you know, especially today, I mean, these are sort of, you know, these were weather events. A hurricane, a tornado, a big wildfire fanned by Santa Ana winds, whatever. So we got to plan for the, you know, so those are the things, those are the realizations of this changing climate. And now that, you know, and it's been said many times, we're getting one every 5 years rather than one every 100 years or something like that. So I think it's, those things help drive it home, because otherwise it's pretty abstract. It's sort of this global statistics. You know, I mean, my wife's really smart. She hates statistics. Most people hate statistics. You know, you start talking about that, eyes glaze over, iPhones come out, you know, you've lost them. You're done. So being able to talk, now you got to have the reasonable attributions, but those are increasingly easy, unfortunately, to do between these discrete high-impact weather events. And it's like, this is what we mean. And people say, oh, okay, I get it. And it also then allows, as we've talked about extensively today, you know, you can almost take the, hey, this is the climate change part of the message off the table if you're going to a right-of-center audience to say, do you want to keep having your house destroyed? No. Okay, well, let's look at such and such.
Yeah, I actually think that disaster thinking, as you frame it, has some value, and I do think, like I said earlier, I think that it's something we need to refocus and realize that we're living in a perpetual state of disaster now in many ways, and a lot of people are all the time. I mean, it's you know, in a disaster, you think about people who are policy thinkers, people who are in charge, they have to think about, are people's basic needs being met? But unfortunately, I don't think people are thinking about that all the time anyway, and consequently, so many people's basic needs aren't being met. So, and the other thing about disaster thinking, about the kind of politics that happens in the context of disaster, is that people use it as an excuse to cut through red tape, to ignore regulations, to make exceptions, and sometimes those things are important and are there for a reason, but a lot of times they don't serve any value anymore. So I think this disaster thinking mode really has some value for us, given the layers and layers of bureaucracy that people often do have to deal with.
Yeah.
I had a question for Dr. Allen and Admiral Titley. So in both of your talks, you talked about in Community 1 there was success, or in Community 2 that it was successful, but in Community 1 it wasn't successful, or in Mississippi it didn't take. And I was wondering what the metrics of success are. And then, for Jonathan, I was wondering, I think in the resilience framing, it's challenging because if you're successful, you're avoiding losses. Someone's basement doesn't flood. And how do we continue the momentum for these types of investments when success is cost avoided and someone's not impacted?
In the case of the my post-Katrina New Orleans research, success was measured, by looking at the census data in terms of people, neighborhoods back to pre-Katrina or close to pre-Katrina levels. But also, I think success is measured in the ability that these communities have to move forward and to have new ideas and to grow in ways that they envision for themselves. And Community 2 did have that, whereas Community 1 was left with no more social capital than they had to begin with, and their hands still out looking for resources. So for me, that was success versus less successful, not necessarily failure.
Just very quickly, one, I wasn't publishing my result, but I live down there. So my version of success is when I drive between the Gulfport Airport down 30 miles to Waveland, Mississippi, how many homes got rebuilt at exactly the same level in exactly the same way? It is a depressing number. Of the things that got built back, not all, but a lot went back at the same elevation, because there's a lot of people who really, truly believe it was a once in a very, very many year lifetime. Also look at population. I mean, to what Barbara said there, and again, I'll just take the town I still have property in, Waveland, probably about 2/3 of population, and all you got to do is spend about 2 hours going through there. I mean, they're hurting. They are really, really hurting. But I do have a good deal on a piece of property down there, so if you want to talk to me afterwards, come see me. Special offer just today.
And I think to answer that, the second part of that question, it just needs to become part of the normal narrative. So you have to shift from, we're doing this for this one-off event or this one-off activity, into this is how we are going to continue to do business as we move forward as a utility and as we move forward providing a service. I would also like to say that as far as disasters go, and I'm sure we're not the only utility to do this, the red tape comment is incredibly accurate. We do some of our best work in disaster and emergency situations, and probably some of our most important work on very sensitive parts of the city are done under emergency conditions, because it's that onerous to do it through the normal planning and approval process that exists around those organisations.
So I'm not sure if this is super well articulated, but I like what Barbara said about social capital. And I think a lot of you mentioned times where one sort of outside group stepped in to try to help. And in a lot of the cases, it sounded like they didn't really succeed, even though they wanted to help. Why do you think they're not succeeding. I mean, within the organizations that are trying to help, are they organized badly? Do people have bad incentives? Do they just not know what they're doing? Is it a budgetary issue where they have to spend money by the end of the year? Is it a lack of expertise? Like, why are all these people who are trying to help, whether it's government agencies or donors or church groups, not necessarily helping?
Being kind of although I've worked most of my life in the nonprofit realm, I consider myself an entrepreneur and kind of businessman. It's incredibly frustrating to work within that bureaucracy. And it's almost, you know, people slam FEMA a lot. It's not, it's federal government, it's bureaucracy, it's top down. There's kind of a stranglehold of control. So, for example, when we went into Moore, Oklahoma, following their most recent disaster, getting to the right audience who is overwhelmed, I mean, again, it's kind of a top-down situation where there are very few people kind of in control, and they're overwhelmed. And in a lot of these situations, these are people who have never been in a disaster. So they're overwhelmed. And for us, it's, again, we've done this handbook, that we have a number of resources. We can't get into these communities because we can't get an audience, and we can't, there's not a, from our vantage point, a well-organized effort that builds on what's come before. I mean, the fact that we haven't met before, the fact that all of us haven't had conversations before, it's just there needs to be much better organization within the profession of disaster recovery. And until that happens, innovations can't flow, and communication is too difficult. And again, for somebody like me who's really accustomed to results, I give up. And that's what I've done in a lot of disaster work, because I won't go through that every time. I don't know if that answers your question.
I would also say that we can draw from a very long history and basis of research on socioeconomic development and aid and assistance to answer that kind of question. And all of that well, not all of it, but a lot of that literature basically says that top-down approaches don't work, that bottom-up approaches do work. I mean, there's a lot of nuance in how bottom-up approaches work best. And I think when we are talking about disasters and climate change, one of the literatures we can draw from is that around community-based adaptation. Bangladesh is really the leader in that. This research on that is fairly new, just a few years old, and so there's still a lot of development in thinking about that. But, you know, generally I would say what it says is that if you are empowering those communities who are most affected by a disaster in the process of planning and or response to them, you're going to get a much better outcome than if you're kind of dropping in on like standardized approaches and institutions, which so often are pretty ineffectual, right? So I think probably Barbara has more to say about that, though.
Well, I mean, the whole point of my talk was what I thought led to more successful efforts on the part of NGOs and help groups. That said, I wanted to mention one background to this whole story that I got involved with in New Orleans is that there was another NGO, I think it was the Urban Land Institute and some other people, who had produced what was referred to at the time as the green dot map in New Orleans. And they actually created a map, and it was sort of led and pushed behind the scenes by developers who had been wanting to get their hands on fabulous property for a very long time. And so the citizens woke up one day, and the residents woke up one day to this map that had declared parts of the city were going to be basically turned into parkland, and another part of the city was going to be portioned off for redevelopment, and only certain parts of the city were going to be able to rebuild as they were. And you know, shock of all shocks, this had socioeconomic dimensions and racial dimensions. And so, but The fabulous thing about the map, and what a lot of groups said, is that this threatening map that eventually got, overturned because it was so unpopular, but the threat of the map, because I think the title on the town's newspaper that day, the Times-Picayune, was 4 months to decide. It gave all neighborhoods 4 months to put together a plan. So they were basically under the gun to come up with something that constituted a plan that would make a case for them being able to save themselves from either redevelopment or parkland. And so it was under that gun that everybody scurried around and came up with this idea of how they might do it. But my point is that the ideas are better if they bubble from below. However, the gun to the head was actually a really good motivator.
There's just something with Waveland. First, I want to make it really clear that the church groups, the faith-based groups, did incredible work on the Mississippi coast. And those guys would be years behind where they are today without that. It wasn't the feds, it wasn't big anything. It was little faith-based groups coming down. Now, we can argue about did they build the right thing or not build the right thing, but they were there, and God bless them. The other part, I'll just give one sort of story that, this bottom-up is good, but there has to be receiving capability. There has to be some sort of local leadership. The leadership was basically overwhelmed. There were several towns on the Mississippi coast where the mayor literally disappeared. Literally disappeared. They had a nervous breakdown. They were gone. So there was nobody running the place. My wife and I got the Monterey, California city, because we have in the Navy and the weather side, our big places are down in Mississippi and in Monterey, California. So we basically set up a sister city thing. And we got the city manager from Monterey to say, hey, to Waveland, what do you guys need? It was building inspectors because they were doing a ton of building. They sent them down. Waveland said yes, they wanted them, but then they didn't know how to use them, or they didn't know what to do with them. So there was then it got to the frustration that Daniel talked about. It's like, well, geez, guys, So it wasn't like there was this external plan being forced on them, but how do you build almost this capacity to respond to something that they had never dealt with before? And that was a challenge.
And I suppose just to umbrella that with a good news story, the District of Columbia actually has two what I believe are very forward-thinking groups within their Emergency Operations Centre. One of them is a volunteer management function within the response and within the recovery components of the organisation. And the other one is a business function within the response and recovery. So it gets to that receiving. And in a real story, DC Water has actually used volunteer groups before to support its operations. And I was frankly amazed. At a Wednesday at 11 o'clock at night, we had 25 people come out and assist us in an operation. So I think it's important from the narrative that at least here in DC, from what I see, we are actually trying to address that there is a need, there are people that are very capable to support. You just need to have a receiving network, as David said, to make sure that you have some way to integrate those people into your response. So.
I wanted to add, I've heard people say probably 100 times in the last year and a half, if you've seen one disaster, you've seen one disaster. And I think that's something that that a lot of experts and big thinkers probably don't really understand it. That you've got to, even within New Jersey, in my experience in the last year and a half, every community is struggling in different ways after this disaster. And so, one of the things that I think set Occupy Sandy apart is that we really did go in there and almost to a fault, we were trying to listen to people and not suggest our own solutions, but hear what people needed and simply offer organizing tools to people who were in desperate need of them. Because in so many cases, people just needed to know how to get together with their neighbors and with other communities, and that was really critical. So in the Rockaways, One of the things they've ended up working on is working for a community benefits agreement with a major developer who's developing one of the biggest plots of land that's undeveloped in New York City. We're also working to develop cooperative businesses with folks. But when you ask most people, they're not going to say that helping a small group of non-English speakers start a cooperative bakery is disaster relief. But when you ask the people in Rockaway what they need, it's jobs, it's economic development, and that's I think that's a critical piece that people neglect. Everybody thinks they're experts, but until you're in it, living that situation, you really don't know what you're talking about. Sorry, no offense to any of you.
Got to live it for 5 years.
So in the interest of time, what I want to suggest is all of you who are currently standing, tell us your questions, and then you have a choice to respond to any and all of those.
Okay. Hi. I have two questions. One is a specific one for Mr. Wallach from the first panel, and since I've had time to think over the progressive panel, it's morphed into an additional question for the whole panel. Particularly, I'm interested in what is the actual tornado history of Greensburg, and have there been innovations along with all of the sustainability work in getting tornado safety integrated with the sustainable architecture and planning? So sort of merging those two. And then for the whole group, because I'm the person who speaks for the past, I'm wondering what you would think of the idea that looking at the history of particular settlements and communities might contribute to looking at their vulnerability and some of their forward planning. And what I mean by that is, as an archaeologist, I have seen many locations across the American West where there have been native groups for literally thousands of years. And when you find those locations, you're like, this is probably a really good place to live. There's probably not a lot of flooding, good wind, all that stuff. Many of our more recent communities than historic, we can say from the historical record, were probably placed where they are for some specific economic or logistical reasons, and are not perhaps as in harmony with all of the forces that are now affecting them. And that doesn't mean that, and I'm thinking particularly of the folks in Cumberland, perhaps were established for some of the bay resources, but that might make them vulnerable to some other things that are coming at them. That doesn't mean those people shouldn't live there. It's now a place, it's now at home, it has identity, but it might mean they need some additional love in preparing for some of the other pressures that are coming at them. Thank you.
Question here.
Daniel, you were talking so eloquently about your success at communicating the sustainability agenda to a more conservative layer of the population. And I'm super curious, your last slide on the screen, I wanted to keep it there longer so I could take a picture, but I'm super curious to know what resources do you find helpful in figuring out how to effectively communicate to that side of the American population.
Your question.
Yes, this is for Sabrina. I'm Joe Browder. Sabrina, you talked as you finished about the need to have answers along with the definition of problems in the year of living dangerously. But in the heat issue, the problem was raised and there was no indication of any sort of solution to it at all. And this surprises me because Dr. Art Rosenfeld, the famed physicist, father of energy efficiency in California, has for years supported an organization, Global Cool Cities, defined years ago that most heat deaths around the world occur in the upper stories of multi-story unair-conditioned buildings, and that something as simple as painting white reflective roofs on these buildings to cool the upper stories makes an enormous difference in the heat rate and the illness rate from heat. So there are some very specific and fairly easily implemented answers to most of the death threats to people from heat waves. And so if they do a years of living dangerously too, you might want to include that in the next one.
Okay, and our last question.
So I found out this week that the United States is the only country in the world that bails out its people whenever there is a disaster. And it seems to me that a more fundamental question is really what we've created as a nation in terms of expectations when a disaster strikes. And I'd like to ask the panel for maybe just your opinion, whether or not the way we've created this disaster fund through FEMA or through some other way is actually something that's sustainable. Let's pretend that Congress actually figures out a way to make it work. Would it be sustainable? Or should we, like the rest of the world, have a very different mentality about how we deal with disasters?
Thank you so much. So let's take maybe another 5 minutes in total and try to address all of these questions that could take days and days.
No problem. Yes, maybe, no. Well, that's an excellent question, and one that I think about a lot. We've got to be innovative and resourceful and get out of this bailout thinking. And again, in Western Kansas, they pride themselves in being very self-sufficient. And so a lot of that was people taking responsibility and responding that way. I think there needs to be a lot of innovation in this space. We've got to figure out how to make that happen. And I'm afraid that the federal government generally, they won't lead, but they will respond, as Dr. Titley said. One of the projects that we're trying to get off the ground is a support network. We want to link people that have been through disaster with people who are just going through disaster. It's a very low-cost way to connect people and give them, both parties, a sense of meaning that they wouldn't otherwise have. And that can be really effective in helping people who are just rebuilding their houses or people who are just dealing with the trauma of a disaster. And that kind of common sense response, we think, would go a long way in stretching those resources.
I've noticed in the last year and a half a lot of a real split in people's expectations, and it seems as though most people who are well off already, who get what they need and have what they need, expect to get a lot after the storm. It's people who routinely are on the margins and have been left out and have learned to not expect very much from government, who expect the least. I met people who live in moldy trailers down in Cape May County who didn't even think they should apply to FEMA because they didn't lose everything. And then people who live in beachfront homes know that they have internet access and they learn about what programs are available to them, learn that they might be eligible for up to $150,000 simply to elevate their home. And so they apply and they get it. And it's the people who, over and over again, it's the people who have the least that don't ask for it. That's been my experience. And people don't have, those people, they think it would be fair for them to get the bare minimum, to get some money to cover some costs. But they're not looking to replace everything, and I don't think that, I disagree with your characterization at the beginning that we bail out survivors of disaster, because I think on the whole, that's not true. I think disaster in this country has become somewhat of a boondoggle, and it's people who know how to take advantage of it do, and people who don't get left behind.
And I'd like to follow up on that. I think that there's a huge social inequity on who takes, if people indeed are taking advantage of it. I mean, they've rebuilt the fancy area of the North Carolina, or is it the South Carolina coast, the multi-million-dollar guest homes and vacation homes over and over and over, because they get wiped out every third year. And those are owned by very wealthy people that have, they've gamed the system. I mean, if we're going to talk about gaming the system, the vast majority of people that live in these areas don't even get what's due to them. I mean, a good example was the horrible oil spill, the BP oil spill off the coast of Louisiana. The people that were, quote unquote, got money, and the people that are still sitting around empty-handed, it would be interesting to look at the demographics of that. And furthermore, I think it's a dangerous road to go down, this sort of neoliberalization of disaster, like, well, you're on your own and you do your own thing, and everybody should, insure their basement against flooding, and on. Because I think that's an oversimplification, and also it takes us further down the road of social injustice to do that. And lastly, I'd like to say I'm not so sure the rest of the world lets everybody do it on their own. I mean, I live a good part of the year. My second home and partner live in Italy, and when they have earthquakes all the time. It's a giant earthquake zone, and until last year they're trying to stop. They go and they help people rebuild. I mean, everybody rebuild, and I have a feeling in Europe, if you were to look around various countries in Europe, that they don't just let everybody, the giant floods that happened in Germany, or the various disasters that have happened in other parts of Europe. I don't know this, so I'm not quoting fact, but I would be surprised if they just let everybody figure it out on their own. I don't think that's what happens.
Yeah, I believe also in Europe, and I would argue, you look at the amount of money the Netherlands spends on flood protection. They're not just letting their population drown and deal with it. I mean, they're spending billions. I think it's going to be about 80 billion between now and 2100, they said, to keep increasing. The location of the communities, I think somebody brought that up. I mean, yes, you're right. I'm not sure what we're going to do about it. Like those towns along the Mississippi coast, which I call one of the most lethal shorelines in America, and it's because of the offshore slope of the waters. But they've been there since the late 1600s, rebuilt, rebuilt, and rebuilt. And nobody's talking about moving it. So that's kind of above my pay grade as far as what we're going to do with it. But yeah, if you sort of map natural vulnerabilities versus where we have our people, look at Miami, look at South Beach. They're going to have an interesting time.
We've been graciously given about 5 more minutes by our person who's usually on time. So, so if you wanted to address some of the other questions that have come up about, where we're living, where we're rebuilding, and communication such, you dive in.
I'll address the comment about the heat wave story. So that was one clip amongst, I want to say there were 5 others that built that overall story, and throughout that story there are recommendations for how we prevent some of these heat risks, some of which, as you say, are very simple. So tree planting, painting white roofs, and actually not very expensive, and can save a lot of lives, and are what I think of as co-benefits. And I think that's a key term that is important to have as a part of this discussion about resilience. So things we can do to both mitigate long-term effects of climate change and mitigate disaster risk. So for example, tree planting reduces the urban heat island effect, also can act as a carbon sink to some degree, and white roofs do something similar. And then secondly, to follow up on the last 2 comments about what other nations do in response to disasters, France was the country by far most and worst affected by the 2003 European heat wave. Think about 15,000 people died just in Paris. And, I mean, this is 15,000 people dying in a period of 2 weeks. Like, this is a lot of people. This is a mass mortality event. France and Europe took this very seriously. So heat wave preparedness programs have been adopted in many European cities, France being probably, I mean, I don't believe there's been a cross-European analysis of this that I can think of, but France was one of the most proactive. There was a 2006 heat wave in France. The heat was not quite as bad. Mortality was much, much, much lower. Now, you can't say cause and effect, their heat wave preparedness program therefore reduced all this mortality. But, it does seem like the effort that they put into it really did decrease the impacts of the subsequent disasters. So I think we can actually really be taking lessons from some other nations as to what we can be doing about planning for and responding to disasters.
I was going to add one more thing about Cumberland, the geographic question. It's interesting because it's an area that it's very rural. It's relatively conservative. There's a strong hunting culture, and it's one of the red parts of New Jersey. But it's also the first place that I ever used a composting toilet, and one of the first community meetings I went to was a multi-stakeholder meeting with a Republican mayor of a town and the Delaware Estuary Conservancy, something like that, about living shorelines. And this was a conversation that they had started years before Sandy. But in a place like Cumberland, yes, they're under threat from climate change. But because of the living systems there, they can also take advantage of the environment to forestall the possibly inevitable. And with the living shorelines, planting plants and putting in oyster beds and things like that, they can actually raise the marshes up over time and create more land, create more time for people to figure out long-term solutions that will allow them to stay in their homes.
Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I've got one. I think I was thinking about what everybody was saying, and we were talking specifically from a governance perspective, and I was thinking about access to funds. So in DC Water, we have about 9 people work on hazard mitigation funding, disaster funds reimbursement, accessing the federal government's funds. And I think in some ways the perception is that mitigation money or disaster fund reimbursement money is, a FEMA truck with people shoveling cash off the back to the hungry masses. And
B-17's flying.
Yeah, dropping big bundles of cash on people. And I think because of the media, we tend to focus on the strip club owner that got $7 million to rebuild a double wide somewhere. And, but beyond that, I think to retain some equity, you really need to get away from the need to have the 7 people working on the application and following the application, because the burden for us as a 1,000-person organisation is the same person as Nate's friend in Cambridge in a double wide. There is no discrepancy between the burden of documentation and the burden of proof and the resources needed to put in that application or to actually know that application process or that process exists. And I think the one thing that FEMA could do and should do is to identify that all of the people applying for these grants or that are entitled to these grants don't have the resources to manage and support them. And even us, we tend to sometimes not submit applications because the cost of managing the team to submit the application outweighs the cost of the application itself. So, I think that's something really to look at going forward as far as, what we can do to make it easier and make a real meaningful impact on the person in their double wide rather than a, strip club owner. I think
Yeah, just to end on a slight lighter note there. You guys, I know, this is not about strip clubs or anything like that. But, so I think most people saw my house in Mississippi yesterday, or the picture of it. I did get a letter from FEMA saying that I was declined for any aid because there was insufficient damage. So I was sort of wondering, does that mean they wanted to see a 30-foot crater in the ground or something? Because it was sort of interesting. I didn't really need their money. I didn't want their money. But to go down, when you go down there, everybody's told you have to register with FEMA. You have to have like this disaster ID number. If any of you guys have gone through this, you get that. And then the process, it runs. It does whatever it's going to do. But I did like the letter saying there was insufficient damage. So I've kept that. That's my one Katrina souvenir. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you all so much. This was really a fabulous discussion.